Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Neo Marketing Podcast. Today we have special guest, Corey Walker, managing partner, Ncite Partners.
Correct.
That's a whole mouthful right there. But he is a talent acquisition staffing specialist. He's an expert, and we're going to talk about all things staffing, about putting together the right team, about keeping the right team, the economics of it, the value of working with professionals like Corey, what's happening now in 2020 because of COVID-19, and working with family members and dynamics like that, all today on the Neo Marketing Podcast.
Welcome to the Golden Group Neo Marketing Podcast, a bi-weekly discussion of best practices, latest trends, and modern techniques for professional business communication, including advertising, marketing, digital channels, social media, public relations, and alternative options.
Good morning, Corey. How are you today?
I'm good. How are you?
Fantastic. So you are a staffing talent acquisition expert, something that we don't necessarily have expertise here at the Golden Group, which is why we love having you on the program today, so we can all learn from your insights. And I want people to understand the need and the value sometimes of working with third-party professionals like yourself to make these improvements in their business. So let's start with the easy stuff. Let's start with how Ncite Partners came about, your background in talent acquisition, and all things associated with what you guys do.
Great question. So prior to starting Ncite Partners, I was in talent acquisition for about 12 years, both on the corporate side as well as in the third party. Worked for a Fortune 500 corporate company. Unfortunately, left there. It actually ended up being one of the best things in starting my own firm back in 2016.
It's funny how the in the moment it looks bad, but it works out well.
It does, yeah. It definitely turned a negative into a huge positive.
Everyone's career path does that, right?
It's true. But yeah, we were founded in 2016. Actually came out of the incubator ecosystem here in Oklahoma City. We were started at the Moore Norman Technology Center incubator.
Great people over there. Good program.
Absolutely. And ended up growing from there. We've grown quite a bit, anywhere from 75 to I'd say 80% kind of year over year the past 4 years. Currently have 4 employees now. We do specialize in nationwide talent acquisition with a pretty heavy focus here in Oklahoma as well in Texas, and have 4 major verticals, those being technology, management consulting, energy, and then our new line, small business, which is actually geared towards helping kind of small to medium-sized businesses find talent, may not have their own recruiting department or may not have really the internal capabilities to do that. So when you think of a staffing firm, we're a little bit different in that we're kind of true talent acquisition and retainment. We kind of really focus on not only the hiring, but also retaining that talent kind of for the long term.
A lot more specialized.
Correct.
Very good. We definitely are going to talk about small business today for sure. Obviously, anyone doing business in Oklahoma and Texas understands the energy sector.
Absolutely.
And the value and importance of that, right? So you personally, what made you take this career path? What was it about working with people and your own personality that made that a good connection?
Yeah, that's a good question. I really love just connecting people. I think I'm very passionate about helping organizations find the right people. I think talent is lost sometimes. You always kind of hear the term war on talent, but I think that's kind of ill-defined. I think making the right hire can make all the difference, much like choosing the right software. But I think a lot of people don't really realize an impact that having the right hire or making the right hire the first time can really have on your organization.
For sure. Like I said, we don't specialize in talent and staffing management, but we definitely specialize in building a business from the ground up, start up through process, and corporate culture is a big aspect of that as well. And you can't even begin to talk about corporate culture, right, unless you have the right people in place, right?
Absolutely.
And that begins at the hiring process, right?
Absolutely.
As opposed to sort of a shotgun approach to whoever comes through the door, right? But really being specific in who you hire for what roles.
Yeah, that's a good question. And a good comment. I think a lot of times people, I think 2 things. I think small business owners and people are very unwilling to hire someone, very unwilling to kind of let go of some of those responsibilities.
Definitely.
I think even managers in medium-sized companies, I don't want to get that off my plate. So I think making that hire is critical to scaling, I would say, first and foremost.
Control factors, I think.
Yeah,
typically when the CEO is the founder, is the the kind of like the brainchild behind the whole thing, right? Like letting go of those reins.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I think second, people are too quick to hire. I think there's kind of a median there. I always say, you'd rather take your time on the front end than you would kind of finding out that somebody's not a good hire in the back end after training them and really kind of employing that institutional knowledge. So, they say it takes even up to a year for someone from hire to really kind of gain full knowledge and be kind of full operational in your organization. So if you kind of have more of that quick to the trigger, hire the first or second person you interview, don't do your due diligence at the beginning, it could really be monumentally just cost-wise for your organization and detrimental in other ways as well.
So that seems like the exact right place, that kind of sort of gray area between being too quick and being too slow. I definitely agree that the growth process of businesses have to reinvest in themselves, whether it's in equipment and real estate or in talent acquisition to grow properly. You can't just be a one-man band for the whole and expect to go from $1,000 a year to $1 million a year, right? But that gray area in between of not too quick, not too slow, and sort of understanding the when and the how is definitely why someone needs to work with third-party experts like yourself, right? Who have that expertise and can kind of help them work through the process, because especially a startup or someone who hasn't owned and managed multiple businesses, they just wouldn't have that expertise on when to slow down, when to speed up, right? So working with someone like you really brings a lot of value to that conversation.
Absolutely. I think there's kind of multiple benefits. I would say the first and foremost is, most of the channels or avenues that most people are going to use are kind of passive channels. So candidates that are unemployed, actively looking, but I would argue that the top talent, the best talent, the most sought after talent is not actively looking, is not on the job market. So we really specialize in sitting down with companies, really kind of helping them find the needle in the haystack. Hey, I need somebody with these 15 requirements. Maybe we can't get all 15, maybe we can get 10 or 12, but really kind of sitting down, I think, and doing that. I think also really helping people work through the process. What does it take from, initial contact all the way to onboarding? Because a lot of people kind of get lost that recruiting is a two-way street. I think they're interviewing you just as much as they're interviewing them.
Yes.
They should. And a lot of our clients don't value it that way and see it that way. And while I know COVID has led to quite a bit of unemployment, I would say within specialized areas, it's still very competitive. You're still seeing a lot of the same technologies, a lot of the same different specialized areas that are just as competitive as they were beforehand. And I would argue they're probably going to be even more competitive. So I think having an outside person to give you advice on how to attract that talent, how to kind of walk them through the process. And I would say thirdly, also kind of getting out of your institutionalism of how you recruit. And what I mean by that is a lot of companies recruit every candidate the same way, and you can't recruit an entry-level new grad the same way you do a CFO, and too many people, don't have that, and we really specialize in kind of helping what we call the candidate experience, making the candidate feel like they're valued throughout the process, and that leads to greater onboarding success, leads to greater retention, and kind of those things combined with, also screening them on the front
That's
end.
great insight right there. When we talk about marketing, it's always about trying to specialize, have primary and secondary audience, and approaching each audience, each segment of your audience, especially if you're different verticals, completely different and unique to each one of them, as opposed to a blanket approach. So taking that same approach to talent makes a lot of sense. Definitely kind of in a relation to how we do everything else in our business, right? One of the things we work with a lot of our clients is if they have not enough staff or too much staff, and often typically when it's too much staff, when they need to lean down, especially like a year like this where you might really need to cut some cost. Or just in management of organization, of putting people in the right places, giving them the right duties, who reports to who, etc. Sometimes there's a lot of just personality involved, especially if you've hired a lot of friends or acquaintances to work for you, and now you have to manage them. You have to be in charge of them. You got to be the boss, right? A lot of times people look to us to be that third party. I don't have any loyalty to anyone. I'm going to tell you the jobs or the job titles or job descriptions you should be cutting, as opposed to you should fire Rick or let Sally go kind of thing. So it seems like that obviously in the talent acquisition aspect is helpful too, right? Because one of the mistakes a lot of the startups make is they hire their friends or people they know, as opposed to looking at talent and what's the pieces in the puzzle to make their business grow, right? So working with someone like you kind of takes that I didn't hire my friend because my experts told me to hire someone else, right? It helps on the personal side of those decisions.
Yeah, that's good. That's a good point. I think also diversity. I would argue that most business owners try to hire people like themselves.
That makes sense. That's a natural
unconsciously
reaction.
or consciously. I think subconsciously. Excuse me. We tend to hire people that are like ourselves, have similar academic backgrounds, come from similar areas, and I challenge business owners that I think if you do that, you're going to find yourself, much like your friends, usually surround yourself with friends that think like you, act like you, whatever the case may be. But if you really, truly want to have a dynamic organization, you need to have diversity of thought, diversity of approaches.
Absolutely.
And I think that leads to having somebody from the outside kind of tap you on the shoulder every now and then and say, have you thought about this? Have you thought about that? A lot way in recruiting. And I say of you same way as, I have certain clients that are very pigeonholed on GPAs. Example, I have a client that
really
requires certain GPAs or requires a certain degree. And, we've worked with clients that we've really been able to open up their eyes about, maybe looking at non-degree candidates, maybe looking at, more seasoned candidates that I think can add a lot more value than they haven't looked at in the past. And I think just kind of mixing things up quite a bit will really kind of help an organization kind of continue to excel as a result of that diversity. For sure.
Those are two amazing points. I'm going to literally make another point to listen to what Corey just said. I'm pointing at the camera for those of you watching the video. Diversity of thought and not building an organization that's homogenous of people from backgrounds, of education levels, it's not just diversity in how people look. It is all the things that people bring to the table when they have different experiences, different backgrounds that make a really dynamic organization. People are finally coming around to that 2020 and in 2021 about the value of diversity, but I think not enough people have been really aggressive in putting people in the room who have different ideas and then letting each of them challenge each other to get the best process for a business. So it's really important. I'm glad you brought that up. I agree
Absolutely.
with you 100% of that. So obviously, Pritch and I, my typical co-host, Pritch Pritchard, who of course is teaching class at OU right now, online, of course. He teaches at a university. He believes in the value of the university experience. I, in 2020, am not as excited about going to college for young people, depending on what field they're in. And so your second point about things, traditional kind of hookups or hang-ups about GPAs or degree fields or which school you went to, et cetera. I think people really hold their businesses back when they get hung up on those very traditional ideas of what minimums that candidates need to hit before they even want to talk to them.
Yeah, I completely agree. I mean, a great example, just coming from the energy background, I know that a lot of oil and gas companies 4 or 5 years ago, prior to the current downturn, were really having a lot of trouble finding talent. It was very challenging. So they really kind of upticked what they were doing with a lot of the new grads, but really found that by hiring a new grad, it takes 2 to 3 years for a new grad to be completely trained up and doing that. So I've seen some companies actually pivot to hiring aerospace engineers or to hiring process engineers from manufacturing that maybe they hadn't traditionally looked at, that allows them to quickly scale those employees internally versus hiring a new grad that you've got to invest all those. And likewise, I've also seen aerospace during the current downturn actually hire petroleum engineers and send them through. I think Boeing has a program where it's a 2-year program. Correct me, it may even be shorter than that, where they actually send them through and make them full aerospace engineers from a petroleum engineering background.
Obviously, there's certain jobs that you do need degrees. Being an engineer, the know-how that comes with being an engineer. Obviously, if you're going to be a doctor, a lawyer, CPA, some of these things do require degrees. I work in marketing. Pritch is in PR. There's a lot of university knowledge versus real world experience, right? Especially in the world of PR, it's changing rapidly. Obviously, digital and social media and all those things have really changed the PR world. Marketing, same thing. Like, I think the rules change every single day as rapidly as these things are happening now, right? So experience and education are sort of there's a balance there, right? And it also depends a little bit too on personality, drive, personal.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, I think we we tend to look at one or two factors, and I think there's a multitude of inputs to that output that ultimately becomes that candidate. And I think we have too much preconceived notion, a lot of that negative or positive about what makes a successful candidate. And we really challenge our clients to really kind of open up, based on what their budget is, to really kind of consider various backgrounds and different approaches. But I have an economics degree and I'm a recruiter, and I have an MBA and I'm a recruiter. So what does that tell you about, they always say, 10 years after you graduate, does it really matter what you majored in? But, besides maybe being an accountant or in technology. But I think, challenging people to really understand that employees grow. There's a lot of people that maybe start out as a petroleum engineer and become a financial advisor, or vice versa, or whatever the case may be. And I think we're seeing technology is seeing a huge growth in that, especially in technology. We have a lot of firms that used to require degrees aren't requiring them as much, and you have a lot of boot camps that are coming out like flat iron school that you can learn how to code in 6 months instead of going to a 4-year degree.
Right. So you mentioned training. Obviously hiring people straight out of school or people that are in the lower end of experience. There's a lot of training, both for their job titles and in ingraining someone in the system. It's how they become part of the corporate culture, right? Is a training onboarding process. A lot of businesses are catching up to the understanding of investing in onboarding and training early saves them a lot of money on the long run, both in better job performance and in the lack of turnover, et cetera, right? What is your experience? What are you seeing? What things are working well for the people you're working with when it comes to bringing in new talent and ingraining them into to a new business?
Yeah, that's a good question. So there's been a lot of different studies depending on the sources, but some have said it can be 2 to 3 times the cost of an annual salary of a candidate.
I believe that,
for training, onboarding, gap, if there's a gap of employment, if a candidate doesn't work out, the toxicity it can have on your culture if there's a lot of turnover. I think there's a lot of costs that are not encapsulated in that number necessarily.
It's hard to put a hard number on it, but to understand the value of it, I think is important, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I would say that the model's really changing from an employee retention standpoint. So we actually more believe in firmly kind of more rolling feedback, more, rolling reviews instead of, waiting for a year review for something to go wrong, more real time. A part of our services is we actually offer retention rates that are 3 or 4 times, our guarantees for our retention of our candidates are 3 or 4 times the average of most recruiting firms, because we do believe that it takes truly a year to 6 months, I would say mainly more a year, for someone to truly become an impactful game changer and a player in your organization. And I think too many people hire, make everybody feel warm and fuzzies after the first week, and then kind of forget about the candidate. And especially candidates that don't have an HR person or a chief people officer or someone that can really hold that process accountable. So a part of our services is we do monthly check-ins, weekly check-ins with those candidates and try to provide that real-time feedback. But we also challenge our owners and managers to do the same, because it's a lot easier to kind of head something off after a month than it is after 11 months, after you've had that toxic culture poison and things like that as well.
Because it really only takes 1 or 2 mistakes to kind of topple down a house of cards that you've been building, especially startup to growth period. 1 or 2 bad hires can really kind of derail something that was maybe on a really upward trajectory of growth. Because of the internal workings, right? Yeah,
I would completely agree. I think especially smaller organizations, but even in larger organizations, depending on the role, you get the wrong accountant in there and they mess up your AR and then you can't pay your bills.
I've seen it happen.
You hire the wrong salesperson that goes to market for your company and ruins your brand. In the same essence, a larger company, you have a larger group, you hire one person, you mess up the toxicity, or you mess up kind of it becomes a toxic group. And, I've seen that really quickly. And I think one bad apple can spoil a whole barrel of them for sure.
Let's talk a little bit let's tie back to some of the marketing things that we do. One of the things that we really try to engage for our clients is not just having customers or clients, but building relationships with them to a point that they become almost brand evangelists, right? Those kind of, as you can say, like here, all my Apple products, I'm a big fan, and we got the DD Audio stuff here, like people that, we're big fans of these businesses, not just that we do transactions with them. So employees can be the greatest asset when it comes to marketing, sales, et cetera, because they're natural brand ambassadors if they really kind of love the business, right? So what are some tips on how to not just have employees, but have people who are part of the process, who buy in and who literally want to become brand ambassadors because of the appreciation for their job and what they do?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think the beginning of the process, I think it's important to really kind of vet that. And I think too many clients don't really spend the time really finding out what the candidate knows about their company. And I think that can be a really big indicator.
Yes, there's a great value in listening to that feedback.
Yeah, and I would also say that you can teach someone a new software, you can teach someone a new way to do a debit and credit, but you can't really teach someone to be passionate about your brand. You can't teach someone to be entrepreneurial, or you can't teach someone to be, succeed in white space, or if you're more of a coat and tie place, you can't turn somebody that's not a coat and tie person into a coat and tie person. So I think we're seeing actually a lot of our clients almost 50-50, 50% skill set, 50% culture fit, because there's a new approach out called Topgrading that was actually founded by Bradford Smart that actually spends more time on the front end, really focus more on what made you become the professional you are, and not necessarily how you can fit a particular position, because I think too many times people try to put a square peg in a square hole, where sometimes a round peg might actually fit better in that square hole. You just need to drill it out a little more, from a cultural standpoint. But I think that's huge. I think, really focusing on that piece, because that turns into brand ambassadors. In addition, that turns into people that want to recruit for your company. If you have a great employee experience while they're out and about, the best developers know the best developers, the best salespeople know the best salespeople. So if you're able to make a great, employee experience, that's going to turn into recruiting, that's going to turn into marketing, and the domino effect of that. And so.
Absolutely, you're absolutely right. It's cause and effect, right? So investing the time, effort, and budget upfront for the better recruiting, better onboarding, better training, actual incorporation of someone into company culture, which also means that they're bringing what they are, their piece to the pie. They might change it, they might move it a little bit, they expand the idea of what your culture is. All these things pay off in the end for longer tenures, better performance.
Absolutely.
And then same thing, recruiting the next round of great employees, because, who do I want to go work for company A or B? Well, my buddy over at company A loves it there, and he wouldn't steer me wrong, right?
Absolutely.
This is the same things that we look for in marketing and brand ambassadors, et cetera. So that's right in the path of the way businesses really need to focus in 2020 and 2021, I think, moving on, because COVID has affected everything. Every business, every person has been as adjusting in some, whether a little bit or giant pivots, or some people unfortunately been already ran out of the market because of COVID-19, right? So being smart, being effective and efficient through the entire process, and understanding that it's all connected, I think the business leaders who understand are the ones who are going to excel in this period, and then the ones who completely are counter to that are the ones who are probably already out of business. So how do we as people who interact right now, we work with CEOs, we work with the C-suite, we work with director levels. How do we have those conversations with them about how they've always done it, and how they need to have this 2020, 2021 post-COVID attitude about things? What are some of the ways you approach those conversations when it seems that the decision makers are very stuck in their ways?
Yeah, that's a good question. Maybe I can point to a very recent example in interviewing. So we've noticed, obviously, everybody's been on a Zoom call over the past couple months.
Which would not happen if we weren't kind of forced into it like this,
but
right?
There are a lot of industries, very traditionally, light industrial, manufacturing, energy, that have been very hesitant to employ more of the, Zoom-based interviewing, more of the technology. And we've seen some companies kind of be left behind, because when the war on talent is going very quickly, when a candidate becomes active, they're applying to multiple companies, and very most often it's whoever gets quickest to the candidate, whoever does the quickest interviewing, the most seamless process kind of wins. But we've had to challenge a lot of our clients to really employ technology to their benefit. So we have had some clients, well, it's not the same as meeting the person in person, I don't get the same feel. completely understand that. But what if you have a 3-interview process, what if you're able to take out the first 2 interviews and make them Zoom interviews and then bring them on site instead of having somebody come back 4 or 5 times, which is the traditional model, and losing out on those. But I think when you approach those conversations, I think pointing to data, I think pointing to, the trends in the market, very much we approach in, a lot of your competitors are starting to employ these tactics. If you don't employ those tactics, you may be left behind. Candidate experience is a good way. I mean, I use the example of the application. How many of us have filled out an employee application that takes longer to fill out the application than it does the initial phone interview? And we've seen a lot of companies that we've encouraged to go to mobile download applications where literally you go on LinkedIn, you can type in your LinkedIn link, and it'll automatically upload a resume and upload the application for you. So I think not cutting corners, but making it easier for the
being
candidate.
Smarter about it, right?
And streamlining as well. But I think it's always just challenging. You've always got to be able to challenge yourselves. And I think there's always, I completely agree that there's certain ways that as a company, hey, this has always worked. But I don't want to come in and challenge the complete status quo. But I do believe that small technology changes, like what I've mentioned, can really lead to some of the things that we've talked about, diversity, and really kind of leading to that. But really approaching, I think, with data and what their competitors are doing, and kind of really understanding the full picture and how that can employ future growth. And
then it's probably another example right now of not trying to do this on your own, but working with third-party professionals, right, who just bring expertise and bring a little bit of neutrality to the conversation, so they're not stuck in the old ways, but bring these different perspectives so that you can manage what is the unpredictableness of business right now, specifically in talent acquisition, right?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I think talent acquisition is changing every day. There's a new software that's hot. There's a new way to interview. There's a new way to find candidates. Where candidates are searching is changing as often as social media these days. From TikTok to the latest thing I haven't been on, and it's changing so quickly. And I think being able to know where to find talent, I think, is really critical. It's changed quite a bit. It used to be, the same 2 or 3 job boards, but now really candidates are used to being approached, and candidates are used to, especially the newer generations, are used to being hunted versus going out and having to hunt. And I think switching that mindset can make a huge difference in employing somebody like you or myself to kind of have that third party. We really need this person. It's going to be an impactful hire. We need to think outside the box in the way we're doing that. And think outside the box doesn't have to be upending the whole process. It doesn't have to be completely reinventing the wheel. It can be maybe changing a spoke or two.
It could be a 10% difference. It doesn't have to be 150% difference, right?
Exactly.
So how has your business adapted to the limitations put on the process because of COVID-19?
That's a great question. So we have actually really kind of strategically positioned ourselves where we're kind of more a value partner with our clients. So we really value kind of being in a deeper relationship. We're more of a true consulting talent acquisition firm in that regard. And there is definitely some limitations when there's more people available for work. There's less positions right now. But I think within the specialized areas, I think that's what's really changed our business as we've become more honed in our specializations.
Really diving down into those niche.
We have, over the past 4 or 5 months, with the help of you, have done some marketing rebranding and have really decided to kind of dive in deep into our niches, specifically taking more of an industry focus and less of kind of a skill set focus. Obviously, skill sets within those industries, but we're finding there's not a lot of talent acquisitions firm out there that do specifically energy, specifically management consulting, and even within management consulting, we do very heavily federal work and things like that as well. But within our own business, as we've had to employ more technology in the way we interview, the way we find candidates, the way candidates want to be contacted is very different now than it was 2 months ago or even 10 years ago. I never thought I'd text a candidate, 5 years ago, and it's the norm now. So
just you have to change with the times, right?
Right, exactly.
And you completely dialed into not just niche, but really establishing a position for your business. Correct. And then operating from that position.
Correct.
Folks, how many times have I talked to you about position on this podcast? Positioning is critical, and Corey is a great example of really diving down into what their true position is and then competing there as opposed to trying to compete in every aspect of talent acquisition, staffing, etc. They understand who they are, what they do, and the value they bring, and they really focus on it, which is ultimately going to equal success for you, for sure. Those people that try to spread themselves too thin, it's hard to have those conversations about stop being so wide and get really focused. But great examples of when you start doing that, you really start seeing traction in those spaces where you win on a regular basis, right?
Yeah, and as an entrepreneur, I would even say we struggled with that when we first started the firm.
Sure.
I mean, we started completely from scratch. We spent a lot of time experimenting, a lot of time, what do we want to focus in? And I think over the past 2 years, we've really gone a lot more specialized and really have gone in the direction that you kind of mentioned on positioning ourselves. Hey, we know what we're good at. We know when to tell our client we're not the best fit for you. I think that fit can be critical for any entrepreneur, any business. And I think, as you told me, it's okay to say no.
Absolutely.
And when you first start business, you think you can't. You try to do everything for everybody. And I think ultimately we've actually strengthened the core of our clients as well as the core of our business by really focusing on what we are passionate about, not just what we're good at, but what we're passionate about and the type of companies we want to work for, and also representing those companies in the market, because having a recruiting firm that treats your candidates and your customers and all those people with respect in the market can be a huge marketing ploy, as well for you.
So I completely agree with everything you just said. And for obviously, it was great advice. But also, I think the key term was roles, having roles, really defining roles, job descriptions, etc. Whether you're hiring someone who you've never met before or a friend or a family member, it takes the emotional attachment out of decision making when it's very defined and on paper.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think it depends on the role. I mean, Abby was hired to lead a specific vertical. She was hired to be a leader in the organization, and we're going to build around her. I think it's a little different if you're hiring your cousin for the summer to do accounts payable.
For sure.
I think the approach is a little bit different, but I think we want to build around her, and I think defining that and what that person, is this a critical family member hire, or is this just an employee for employee's sake hire, if that kind of makes sense.
So I'm going to tell you a kind of sort of a headhunting HR horror story that happened to me from my past about 15 years ago. But before I do, I want to ask you, without naming names or spilling who it is, have you seen a couple of giant, like, oh my God, I can't believe they do this in their hiring process, failures that companies have made in the past that you're like, you would think from the outside it's a very successful company, and then when you saw their hiring process or something they did in talent acquisition, that you thought, wow, how are they this bad, or maybe even borderline unethical or illegal? Can you give an example without throwing any specifically into the bus?
I can't remember without naming names, an example of probably about 4 or 5 years ago, we had a client that was literally having a candidate interview with people, just to have an interview with people. And so they were notorious for wanting, I think they were a company of probably 40 or 50, and they wanted each employee to literally interview with half the company. And it led to a very cliquish culture, because I think they became so unified in what they were looking for that it led to some kind of questionable, hiring processes and I wouldn't say biases, but biases that led to very, very ugly results. But I think in addition to that, they lost really good talent, and they ended up finding people that were willing to bend over backwards and not break the status quo. Because I think if an employee or a potential candidate's willing to go through any hoop you throw in their way, whether that be 25 interviews or whatever the case may be, is that really a diversity person that you want? Is that somebody, uniquely kind of brings that perspective, if that makes sense?
So, like I said, I think now, if I start doing the math, it's like 12, maybe 15 years ago, I had kind of been a transition out of the music business into marketing in 98. And so about 7-8 years after that, which would be 12 years ago or so, right, in this time frame, roughly, I had done really well in the marketing and creative side, and started considering working and I've been doing corporate marketing. I was considering the agency route. Let's go work at an agency. Let's see what that's all about. So put myself out there, put some feelers out, applied for some different ad agencies. Got a first interview, got a second interview with this particular ad agency. And then my third interview would be with the vice president of the organization. And so I was feeling really good about my prospects. Went in with, and this is, a few years ago, so like I still had a physical portfolio, like literally a physical portfolio of works, and kind of Mad Men style, like lay out the ads and stuff in front of you and all that. Went in prepared, dressed, ready to go, knew everything about the place I was going, so I could ask some good questions, have my great portfolio. Went in and thought I just knocked the interview out of the park. I was like, man, this is fantastic, and I really expected them to offer me the position as a creative director for this agency. And the VP's this whole thing. We spent about an hour together, and finally he gets to that point where he starts to turn the conversation. I'm like, all right, here comes the offer, and he stops kind of in the mid sentence and just kind of looks at me and goes, so I just want to let you know, I would never hire you. Caught me off guard for sure. I'm like, okay, this is my third interview, and so it's not that I'm not qualified, and we've had a great conversation at this point. I really felt like I answered all the questions great, and your physical reactions to my book and everything. I was like, okay, I'm explaining. He just looked at me dead in the face and said, you're the guy that within 6 months thinks he can take my job, and within a year would probably have it. So thanks for coming in, but we're going to be hiring someone else. Have you heard stories that bad? Worse?
Yeah, we've actually had experiences with hiring managers where they don't want to hire someone with too much horsepower because they don't want that person to overtake. And I think as an owner and a business owner, you've got to be careful on that, because when the organization gets large enough, I think there's enough layers in the interview process where you're not necessarily involved every day. And likewise, I think that will lead to them hiring people that are less capable.
Yes.
If I just want a worker bee, and if that's what you want, that's great. If you want somebody to fill a butt in a seat, that's fantastic. But to truly grow, I think you've got to sniff some of that out, because I think there are a lot of people out there that we call them steady eddies, people that want to stay in the same seat for 15 years, want to work 8 to 5, and that's great. That's fantastic. But I think from an organizational standpoint, you've got to be a little careful to kind of sniff some of that out before it does happen.
Right.
For sure.
So, Corey, let's give one or two pieces of your favorite bits of advice you like to tell people when it comes to talent acquisition, about retaining talent, about the value of keeping good people. Just when people go, hey, what's your favorite bit of advice? What do you like to tell people?
That's a good question. I think really diversifying your employee base.
I agree 100% on that.
I think at the end of the day, I know there's a lot of centralization around diversity right now, and I think diversity is defined by multiple things. It's not defined just by skin color.
For sure.
It
needs to go much deeper.
Educational. It's where you grew up. It's what part of the country you grew up. We've seen companies that maybe are based in Oklahoma that have never hired somebody from outside of Oklahoma, and then you hire somebody from a different part of the country that has a different way to look at things, or maybe opens you up to a new client base, or no matter what your background is, I think bringing different ideas to the table. And there's been studies that your processes and all of your performance can increase by 50% by doing that. So.
Fantastic advice. I agree with it 100%. Again, much like I've agreed with everything Corey has said today. I love the perspective. Thank you for bringing some different experience and skills to the Neo Marketing Podcast and what we typically talk about. But it's the whole talent process, acquiring, hiring, keeping, retaining, all the way through becoming brand evangelist and recruiters for the business as well, for your next employee hire, is essential for businesses to grow and thrive. And that's what we do here on the Neo Marketing Podcast. So appreciate your time and expertise today, Corey.
It's great.
As usual, you guys, we appreciate you guys tuning into this episode. Make sure you hit the subscribe button. Make sure you leave a comment, leave a review, hit the thumbs up, the heart button, whatever it is. However you found us on social media, we appreciate you. However you listen to the podcast or watching the videos, we appreciate you tuning in. We'll be back in 2 weeks. And here we are, December 2020. What a ride it's been. What a year. I still got a little bit of my no shave November happening here with my quarantine cut. That is not a cut. So we're going to end the year strong here on the podcast with some more great experts, guests, and advice for you. Appreciate you guys tuning in. We'll see you next time on the Neo Marketing Podcast.
This has been the Golden Group Neo Marketing Podcast. Make sure to subscribe so you never miss an episode. Tell a friend, leave a review, and engage with us on social media. Thanks for listening.